we were talking about painting materials and techniques when we stopped last time, and we got into oil painting. Oil painting is defined by the binder, once again, the thing that holds the pigment together and allows the artist to apply it to a surface. Oil painting is made up of pigment mixed with linseed oil, usually, although they also use poppy seed oil, and they use walnut oil as the binder as well. And it was a type of material that was used in the late Middle Ages in the 13th, 14th centuries for manuscript painting, because, you know, in a manuscript or a book, you're turning pages, and so tempera, which we talked about last time, if you use that to paint the images on the page, when you turned that page, you would crack the tempera, and so they had to come up with some medium that wouldn't crack when you turn pages of a book. And so they came up with this idea of oil painting. And so it was used, first of all, just in book illustrations. And then in the 15th century, artists began to experiment with it on a larger scale, using it to create what we call easel paintings, you know, paintings that can be taken from an easel, hung onto a wall, you know, that are, you know, small to medium size. They're not wall size, usually, paintings. And so in the 15th century, artists began to use, you know, to adapt this material that had been used for books, you know, to a much larger scale. And Jan van Eyck, that painted the painting that you see here on the right, that we've looked at before, he is always given credit for developing oil painting, but he really didn't. He may have had something to do with deciding, yes, I can use it on a larger scale, and I can use it, you know, for paintings like this. So one advantage was that oil painting doesn't crack as easily. Another advantage was that oil paint dries more slowly than tempera does or frescoes, and so you can work with it longer, and you can get many different kinds of effects with it. You know, we talked about when we looked at this before that one of the effects that people always notice is how the material really looks like material. The texture of the fur is given. You know, the wiriness of the dog versus the soft sort of fur on the edging of this garment, or, you know, the brass sort of hard effect of the texture of a chandelier or a mirror. All of those things are possible because the artist can work more slowly with oils because they dry more slowly. And so oils began to be used and eventually became the primary material that was used for painters that wanted to create an easel painting similar to what we see here. And you can see some of the differences. It's always easier if you look at an actual work of art than when we look at it in slides. But I think you can see some of the differences between the way the oil paint has allowed, you know, like the light reflections to show in the mirror here, or the light reflection up here in the chandelier. The color just looks more saturated, it looks richer, it looks brighter than we see in the color over here in this fresco that we talked about last time that Giotto had created. With fresco, it dries so quickly that you can't work up all these textural details, and you can't get these effects of light. And so, you know, artists saw, you know, the slow drying quality of oil paint as being a real advantage. You know, they could begin to really create these effects of nature, of naturalism, you know, within their work. Jan van Eyck developed a technique that is called glazing, or the use of glazes. And what glazes are, they are transparent layers of paint that are used in oil painting. Linseed oil is added, you know, to mix the pigments, and then in order to thin that linseed oil, they will sometimes add turpentine. Turpentine is the solvent that's associated with oil painting. It's what is used to clean the brushes, and so it's also used to thin the paint sometimes. And so by mixing, certain amounts of the turpentine with the oil paint, Jan van Eyck could create this sort of transparent layer of paint that he would then apply, onto the surface. These paintings that you're seeing here are still wood surfaces. The support is of wood, which have been traditional, and so even though he is developing a new kind of painting, or he's using a new kind of painting, he's still using that wood surface. And so since it's that wood surface, they did all the same steps in treating that wood surface that we saw with the tempera. There's the layers of underpainting, and there's the layers of linen that are applied to the surface. So the whole surface was treated exactly the same, but the final layers that were put on were different and were this oil paint. And he would apply several layers of oil paint. One, not Jan van Eyck's work, but one artist from the High Renaissance period from the 16th century sometimes applied up to 40 layers of oil paint before he really considered his works to be finished. The problem with doing that and with using several layers is that you have to wait for each layer to dry before you would go on to the next layer. And so sometimes these paintings would take years to complete, depending on how many layers of oil glazes they were planning on using. But it had many advantages because you could get all these textural effects and all these effects of light. And oil paints really give you the effect when you look at an oil painting. You feel like you're looking through layers. It's like the light is going through several layers and then finally getting to the back, the very bottom, and then sort of bouncing back towards you. And so it really makes the paint look luminous, like it's glowing with light. And a lot of artists like that sort of effect. But oil paint has a lot of other techniques that have been used. This was the beginning in the 15th century. Oil paints were used up to the 20th century. And so, in the next 400 years, lots of different kinds of techniques were developed, and I'm just going to mention a few of them. We've already talked about impasto, where you use just the thick paint, the linseed oil, and the pigment. You don't thin it down. And in fact, sometimes in the 20th century, they would actually add another material to it to make it even thicker. But Van Gogh here, in painting this work and giving us these ridges of paint that we see back here in the background, he really didn't use any other materials, just the thickness of the paint that he's working with. So, artists realized, we don't have to work at a thin layer. We can get expressive kinds of details if we allow really thick layers to show. We can get that kind of actual texture if, they wanted it. Another technique that you see here is called wet on wet, and this is a bad colored slide. It's the best for showing the different layers of paint, but actually there isn't a lot of color in this. It's mainly grays and blues that this artist is showing us here. But this technique is called wet on wet, and in this technique you apply one layer, one area of the oil paint, and before it dries completely, you paint right on top of it with another layer. And what happens sometimes, depending on how wet the underlying layer is, you end up smearing the paint and sort of mixing the two different layers together. And so it's a way of getting slightly different tones of color than, just mixing them in pigment. And it was also, it tends to give a rather spontaneous kind of effect. You really feel like the artist was in such a hurry to paint it that he didn't have time to wait, for the paint to dry. And he just painted right on top of it. So William Turner in the early 19th century, used this wet on wet technique. There's another technique called wet on dry, and that's where you build up layers, this impasto of paint on the bottom layer, the first layer. You allow it to dry to the point where it's not going to smear, And then sometimes what they will do is they will drag a brush with wet paint across it, and usually the ridges of the paint catch that next layer of paint, but not the valleys. And so you get this, effect of seeing different layers, the underlying layer, below the top layer that's been applied. They can also reverse it. And they can use a dry brush, a very dry brush, on top of another dry layer too, but it still is usually called a wet on dry sort of technique. And then still another technique that developed in the 19th century that the Impressionists used was called alla prima. And they also combined that with impasto, the thick paint. And here you're seeing a painting made by Claude Monet, an Impressionist artist, and here you're seeing one detail of that surface. So again, you can actually see the ridges of paint, the thick impasto paint that's being used. What alla prima means, it means painting directly. And so the Impressionists developed a technique where they didn't work all these different layers. They're in the first place, they're painting with canvas. Canvas is a new material that comes in the 16th century. And artists begin to use canvas because it's more absorbent than wood. They realize also that it's more flexible. When you finish a painting on canvas in oil paint and it's completely dry, you can roll it up. And it doesn't damage it too much. And so canvas came in the 16th century, and so Claude Monet is still using canvas here. But instead, even after they adopted canvas, they still used all those underdrawing layers and all those other techniques they had used when they were working with wood panels. And what the Impressionists decided to do was forget all those underlying layers. Just take a canvas that's primed, is ready for oil paint, go out into nature and paint exactly what you see very quickly and, really record. What the Impressionists were trying to do was record nature at a certain period of time under a certain light condition. And for Monet, for example, when he went out to paint, he would usually take maybe 10 canvases with him. And each of those canvases would represent a different light condition, like maybe one would represent a cloudy day, another one a sunny day, and different times of the day. And then as the light changed from the sun during the day, he would switch from one canvas to the other. And he's trying to record exactly what light looks like under certain light conditions and certain time conditions. And so as, they couldn't prepare a canvas with layers and layers and layers of paint. They had to paint directly. And so that's what alla prima means. It means at the primer level, they would prime the canvas so that it was more absorbent. And also priming helps canvas by protecting it from the oil paint. Oil paint, canvas is simply a woven fabric. So it has little holes in it that we really can't see, but they're there. And oil paint, if it sinks in the holes and sits there in that hole, it won't dry as quickly, and so it starts to rot the canvas. And so what they learned to do was to put a primer, gesso usually, that gypsum and glue that we talked about last time. They would put that on the surface, and that closed up all of those little holes so that the oil paint couldn't get down in the holes. And so it helped to prevent the holes from rotting. So, the Impressionists would take out canvases that just had that primer level on, and then they would paint on it each day. Then another kind of, I didn't realize this was cut off here, another kind of material that's used for painting is watercolor, and that means that the paint, the solvent or what's used to clean the brushes is just water. So this is a water-soluble kind of material that's used. And watercolor is made up of a pigment mixed with glue Arabic, and there are usually some other materials that are combined with it. but it still is very washable out of water. What they do is they usually paint on paper with watercolor, and the paper is dipped into a water trough and very carefully dampened, not so it's just wringing wet. They take it out so it's just damp, and that allows the paper to absorb the watercolor paint when they begin to paint on it. And again, this is a technique that the Chinese began to use long before the rest of Europeans or Americans began to use it. And so the work that you're seeing up here at the top is a watercolor combined with ink that Chinese artists also used to create this landscape. And then down here at the bottom, you're looking at a 20th century American artist that used watercolor. And the one at the bottom really shows you some of the effects that you can achieve with watercolor. Watercolor is very thin. It's very transparent. And so when you apply it to a paper surface, it doesn't really cover up the paper entirely. The paper shows through. And so it changes the tone slightly of the color that's being used. So artists have to be aware that that happens, and they can actually use it to their advantage to get different kinds of effects. So here, you can see in these areas right here that you're really seeing this through the blue. You're seeing the white of the background affecting that blue. They also, have to be very careful because since the surface is wet, it's very easy to cause watercolor to sort of drift off into areas that you don't want it. And you can't cover up mistakes because this is transparent. So you just more or less have to start over if you've lost sort of the control of that watercolor. But you can get, some very spontaneous kinds of effects, as this artist did here with this work, or you can get very detailed effects, as the Chinese artist did up above. Another kind of material that is related to watercolor is gouache. And in gouache, they add another material to the basic watercolor to make it less transparent, so that it can be worked with a little more. If you make a mistake, you can cover up the mistake if it's not too big a mistake. And so it accomplishes one problem of watercolor, it being able to be painted over. But in adding the white, it's an opaque white usually that is added to the watercolor. It tends to dull the colors. This is a gouache work that you're looking at here. The colors don't have that transparency, and you don't see that white of the background showing through. They just don't look quite as luminous. They look a little duller or more matte in effect when artists use this gouache sort of effect. But gouache is basically a watercolor that has this white opaque paint that's added to it. Then in the 20th century, a new kind of medium developed. There are several different kinds. They're all called synthetic media because these are paints that were manufactured using not just minerals, natural minerals and things like that, but actually chemical mixtures that are created. Today, mostly the synthetic media consist of acrylic paint. That's usually what's used. It's what's also called latex when you buy house paint, for example. What acrylic paint or latex paint is, it has a plastic polymer that is the binder for the pigment. And many artists use this today because it cleans up with water. It is, in a way, a watercolor. It's just a different kind of watercolor. And you can thin the paint with water. You can clean up the brushes with water. And for some artists, our painting teacher, for example, that works here, he's allergic to turpentine. He can't inhale any solvent. It causes him to have trouble breathing. And so this is just a safer kind of material to use because it doesn't have any harsh solvents attached to it at all. This kind of media developed in the early 20s, the 1920s, and it was used as a commercial product. It was used in creating designs, the labels for different products. It was just used in a more commercial sort of way. And then the artists discovered it, and artists began to use acrylic primarily in the 1960s. They knew about it and experimented with it, but really after the 1960s and 70s, it sort of became the dominant media to use. There's still oil painters and watercolor painters too, but a lot of artists use acrylic. And acrylic is very versatile also. It has, you can paint with it with a brush just exactly the way oil painters paint. And you can get almost the same effects. When you talk to artists who use acrylic, they will always defend it and always claim that they can get exactly the same effects. But I think when you compare an oil painting to an acrylic painting, you see a difference. The oil painting looks luminous, as I said. It really looks like you've got depths of color and that light is sort of coming out of that color. And the color in acrylic paint looks much flatter. You don't really get that sense of depth in the color. But you can achieve the same realism, the same great detail. It dries more quickly than oil, but it still takes a little time to dry. So you can work up textural effects, and you can work up all those details of light if you want to. But what many artists did in the 70s was to use acrylic paint to explore some new techniques, new ways of applying paint to the canvas. And you see just one of those techniques here with Helen Frankenthaler's work. She took large canvases and placed them on the floor just like Jackson Pollock, who had dripped paint, and most of his paint was oil paint that he used. She uses acrylic, but she puts the canvas on the floor, and then she will pour acrylic, one particular hue in an area, and then she either gets down and with her hands or sometimes sponges, she pushes it around and creates the forms, by using her hands or these sponges. And another thing about acrylic paint that she took advantage of was that you don't have to seal the canvas background. It doesn't matter if the acrylic paint sinks into the little holes in the canvas because it's plastic, and so it doesn't rot the canvas the way that oil does, and it dries faster. So what she discovered in using this acrylic was that you could get some really, they're almost like atmospheric perspective effects. Here in this work, many of her works are called landscapes because they almost look like, she has an area of ground right here, and then here is the sky, and maybe these are cloud formations. The acrylic sort of sinks into the canvas, and it sort of gives the effect that it's coming out of the canvas, that it's always been there. And so it sort of implies a depth in the canvas that isn't possible if you seal that canvas. When you seal that canvas, the paint often looks like it's sort of floating on top of the surface of that canvas. It doesn't look like it's coming from inside the canvas. And so it was just an effect that she liked, and she began to really explore in her work. Another thing about acrylic is, since it dries fast enough and faster than oils, you can use other techniques. For example, Kenneth Nolan, in creating these very hard edge forms that you see here, and his style is called hard edge, he actually created these lines by taping the canvas, by putting painter's tape or just regular masking tape on the surface of the canvas, and then he would paint against, that tape, wait until it dried, the layer dried, and then you could take the paint the tape up, and it didn't remove any of the paint underneath. Since oil dries so slowly, you can't do that very easily because you risk damaging what you've already painted. Because even when oil paints feel dry on the surface, when you can touch them and they don't feel like they're wet at all, sometimes inside of that layer that's dry, it's still wet. And if you put tape on it, the tape will pull it off of the canvas. And so, acrylics allowed for, another new technique to be developed, which led to a new style of art that you see here, a very non-objective sort of style of art with these very crisp, contour lines of the forms. Then I want to talk about a couple other things that are classified as painting because they're two-dimensional. They use color, and they create sometimes similar kinds of effects, but they don't always use paint. The first is collage that you see represented here. Collage is an old technique, but Pablo Picasso in the early 20th century revived this technique and used it in his style of Cubism. And what a collage is, you paste something on a surface. You can paste a piece of paper. We've talked about how actual texture is added when they sometimes will glue a wheel or a lampshade or other things on the surface. Picasso began by gluing pieces of paper on the surface and also pieces of linoleum. This chair caning that you're seeing here is actually a piece of linoleum that had that pattern printed on it. And so he glued that to this surface, and then he painted on top of it. This area right here is paint that he's painted over this linoleum. This area is paint also. So is this area right here. Most of this at the top is all painting. So collage is taking any foreign object or material and gluing it to a surface, and then usually painting on top or incorporating that paper or whatever material has been used into the whole composition by painting around it or painting slightly over it, so that you really have to look close to know whether you're looking at something that an artist has just represented or whether it's something that he's pasted on. And so collage is usually classified as another technique and a different kind of material to use to create a painting. And then finally, another kind or another type of art that has nothing to do with paint, actually, are mosaics. And what a mosaic, and here you're looking at a mosaic that was created in the Roman Empire period. What mosaics are, they are two-dimensional scenes like you see here, but instead of using paint, artists use what are called tesserae, and I spelled that for you here. Tesserae are little pieces of stone or glass that are carefully worked together in order to make representational images. And they are very small. They take hours to create mosaics. The Romans and the Greeks used mosaics on the floors of their houses. It was a way of protecting the floors. They were often used in bathhouses, because there was a lot of water in the bathhouses. So the Greeks really developed this technique. Then the Romans adopted it from the Greeks and used it in their technique. And, they would create, scenes like this. This is supposed to show you a dining room, and it was on the floor of a dining room, as if they've had a meal and they've just dropped bits of food and bone and whatever on the floor, and they've just left it. They haven't swept it up. Sometimes there are mythological stories that are shown in these mosaics. So there can be a variety, of subject matter that's used. But the painting material, or the thing that makes the objects and gives the color, for the Greeks and the Romans were all natural stones. They would look for natural stones of all different hues. This looks rather monotone, but that's just a slide. It actually has more color than you see here. They would carefully grade all the different hues that they found of natural stones, and then they would use that to create their mosaics. Then in the Middle Ages, what the Middle Ages did was to take this technique of tesserae, but instead of using natural stones, they began to create uniform little squares of glass. And the glass was colored. It could also have gold leaf in it. And they began to create mosaics on the walls of buildings, not on the floors. And they became the important area for telling stories, about the religion or the politics. Here you're looking at a scene that was on the wall of a church, and is on the wall of a church. It's still there, in Ravenna, Italy. And it's all made of colored glass, and then the gold in the background is gold leaf. And this shows the emperor of the Byzantine Empire at that time. His name was Justinian, and he had recaptured or captured part of Italy and brought it into his empire. And so in this church, he sponsored the building of this church, and so he had himself represented in a scene, to indicate that he had been a sponsor of this church. So you see him standing right here in the center, and then his military and his court officials on one side of him and the church officials on the other side of him. And I brought in the detail because it allows you to see the little squares that are used in order to create this work. And again, it was a very painstaking, technique to use. They used very small squares, any place where they wanted to create shadows and highlights, where they wanted to sort of model, the hand here, for example. So while this doesn't use the usual kind of painting materials that we've talked about, it's two-dimensional, it uses color, and so it's still classified as being a painting. So mosaics is just another of these odd sort of techniques that were used. So that brings us to printmaking, and printmaking is the last of these two-dimensional arts we're going to talk about. When I say printmaking, I mean that there are artists who create an image and they duplicate that image a number of times. They make a print, and the techniques that they use allow them to create multiples of those prints. And so I'm going to talk, again, I need to first of all talk to you about a few terms that are particularly associated with printmaking. But the thing to remember is that this is a reproductive art, and every one of the prints that are made are considered original works of art. We tend to think of original works of art as being one of a kind. We talked about that when we were talking at the beginning about what art is and about some of those assumptions about things. And we tend to think, that if something is reproduced several times, then it must not be as high quality or can't be as good. And printmaking is often confused with the kind of prints you can buy. Sometimes they're sold over at the Union. A company will come in with all these prints. But there's a difference. The ones that we're talking about here, an artist made, and even though he may not do the actual printing, he's always there while the printing is being done, and he can make corrections. He won't let the image deteriorate, and if it does begin to deteriorate because of the presses that are used, he'll stop the printing, because it means his image has changed, and it's not what he meant it to be. And so he doesn't consider it to be the right quality. In the kind of prints that you buy over at the Union, maybe, or that you can sometimes buy at Walmart or other places, those are, in the first place, photographic prints. They're just like Xeroxes. They've taken a print and they've simply repeated it hundreds of times. No artist has been involved. Maybe the original image was created by an artist, but then when the printing started and the hundreds and hundreds of copies were made, no artist was involved. And so, there may be a deterioration. The quality may not be as good in some of the later ones as in the first ones, but no artist stopped them. They just made as many as they wanted to make money. So you have to be really careful, and even over at the Union sometimes, they will say things like, this is Miraut's print, or this is a Rembrandt print. Both of those artists are dead. And so they didn't have anything to do with the copying of that print, the making of that print. So, they're not really responsible for the quality, and you shouldn't pay too much for them. And sometimes with a Rembrandt print, they'll try to get as much money as they can out of you. But he had nothing to do with it at that point, so you shouldn't really pay. Artists that create prints usually set an edition, and what that means is they decide how many they're going to make, and that's the limit. So maybe an artist would decide, I'm going to make 100 copies of this image, as long as I'm sure that the image is always the same, that nothing happens to it. And so when they sell their print, if you look at the bottom in one of the corners, usually the right-hand corner, you'll see in pencil some numbers. And maybe it will say 27 of 100. What that tells you is that it was the 27th print that came off of the presses out of 100 the artist was going to make. And so that guarantees you a certain quality. It also guarantees the price. You know that if you're buying something for $50 or $100. And one thing about prints, they're cheaper. So it's a way of having original art without having to pay thousands of dollars for it. But if the print says it's 27 of 100, you know that artist is going to make only 100. And therefore, whatever you're paying will be in relationship to how many copies there are. And you know that your price of maybe $50 is not going to be devalued by the artist suddenly deciding, I think I'll make 1,000. Because, it's that supply and demand idea. The more supply, the less demand and the less price often is what happens. So that's what the edition means, that they set a certain number that they're going to make. When all of the prints are run through presses, except for one technique we're going to talk about. These are heavy presses that the plates or the stones are run through and paper is pressed against them to transfer the image. They're all inked before the paper is put on. And when each of those prints is run through that press, they very carefully pick it up because the ink is still wet and they don't want to smear the ink. And that process of taking it off of the plate, whatever they've used to put the image on, that's called pulling the print. And so that's what that means. Artist proof is the first image that is made of the image, whatever it is, on that plate. And it's usually the one where the artist is verifying that everything is printing exactly the way he wants it to. And sometimes if something is not dark enough or a detail doesn't show just the way they want it to, then they'll go back and work on that plate to get it right. And so the first copy is usually not sold, and the artist will write at the bottom of it, artist print. And often these are the copies that will be traded. Artists trade their work a lot. I'm always sort of envious because most of us have to pay, for the art. And artists often trade works with each other. And so the artist's proof will often be the one that they will give to another artist. But once in a while you can buy it. And so if you see a work that says artist's proof, that's probably the first one, the first copy that's made. And it probably is a pretty good copy. And so it'd be worth, paying a little bit more money for maybe. And then finally, after they've run the edition, after they've made whatever number they're going to make, ethical artists, and not all artists are, ethical artists will strike their plate. And what that means is they damage it in some way. They will just take, something that will cut that plate and they'll just put a big X across the image or do something else. And so if you ever find a print, that has those kind of damage marks on it, you know that somebody's taken some artist's plate that he has damaged in order to say no more copies, and they've tried to reuse it. the one thing about some artists, and this is the case with Rembrandt, and that's why you sometimes can still see Rembrandt prints sold, is that Rembrandt did not strike his plates. He often would rework them and reuse them for another edition. He'd always make changes, so it wasn't a case of just reproducing the same thing that he'd made before. He would make changes, but as a result he died, and those plates were not struck, and so they can still be used by unethical people. There are also other things that happen. For example, you can usually find Dali prints around, and be a little careful of those too, and don't pay very much for them, because Dali had Alzheimer's before he died, and so while he was being cared for when he had Alzheimer's, the people that were taking care of him handed him hundreds of blank pieces of paper and had him sign those papers. And then later on, they printed them with images. And so the images may not have had anything to do with Dali. They look like Dali's work, but he didn't approve them, although it looks like it because his signature's down there. So usually, artists will strike their plates so that can't happen. It can't be reused. You can have the same thing happen in sculpture. We'll get to talking about sculpture later. Sculptors sometimes make molds that they use to make sculptures, like Rodin did that. And sometimes those molds are not damaged or destroyed, and so they have been reused later also. So the kind of categories that printmaking falls down into, and this has to do with the techniques that are used to create a print. There's 4 general categories: relief, intaglio, planography, and serography. And so I'm going to go through each of them and talk to you about how the plates that are used to create, that have the image that's then reproduced on paper, how they're created. And so the oldest is relief block printing. It goes back to the Middle Ages, at least. It was used before there was a printing press, to create printed images of things. Although most good books were hand-done by painters instead of being prints. In a relief block technique, the image is the raised part, and what they do is they cut back anything, and they use wood blocks. That's what they're using. Wood blocks are used. They cut back away from that image. So the image is in the raised areas right here. And once the image has been created, they then wipe it with ink, making sure, and cleaning it up if they have to, making sure that none of the ink gets down here in these lower areas, and then paper is pressed against it, and the paper picks up the ink up here on the top, which has the image in it. And so that's how a relief block is created. Albrecht Dürer is a high Renaissance artist, and he's probably the expert at using both relief block printing and the next category of printing that we're going to look at. So this is a wood block print that he created. Now, so keep in mind, everything that is black, everywhere that's in black is a raised line. Anything that is white has been cut away from that block. So it's very, it's an arduous process, and great care has to be taken in order to create these very thin lines and not break, if you would break a block and you just insisted you had to have that line where that line was supposed to be, you'd have to start all over with a new image. And so the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse that you see represented here was created in a woodblock technique, and you can get quite a bit of detail, all of the detail, all of the variations from sort of grayed areas to darker areas, all of that's possible. But line is the main thing. Line is really what defines the lights and the darks and creates, the forms that you see here within the work. Color wood blocks are also used. The Japanese really specialized in color wood blocks, although there are European artists that have used them as well. And this is a wood block, color wood block, that was designed by an artist named Hokusai, called Wave at Kanagawa. And it was part of a series of images that he created, all of them having to do with Mount Fuji. Mount Fuji is a sacred mountain to the Japanese, and so in every one of these images, 3 different images that he created, you always see Mount Fuji somewhere within it. In a color woodblock technique, they use separate wood blocks. And here, it's a fairly simple wood block, but you could have much more variation in color. And every single difference of color, like the dark blues here versus the light blues versus the whites, each of those take a separate wood block. So a wood block was carved that only had these areas with, the lines defining the, the outer contours of this white area, because the white area would have been the background. Then another wood block was carved to give all of these light blue areas. And another wood block was carved to create all the dark blue areas. So, you have to have all these separate wood blocks, and so they use a method that's called registration. And in registration, you usually put a small dot in each of the corners, and then as they line up one wood block to be printed over, an image that already has one of the colors on it, they carefully line up the dots on the wood blocks so that when it's printed, there won't be any overlap of any colors. Hokusai didn't do the whole thing. The process that was used in Japan was involved at least 4 different people. There would be the person who designed it, and we believe Hokusai was the one who designed all of these images. So he made this image that you see here. But then he just turned over the image on a piece of paper, probably that he had colored, with watercolor so that they knew which colors he wanted them to use. He handed that paper over to a person who carved the wood blocks. And then another person may have added the color and decided on the color. We don't even know that Hokusai always decided on the color himself. And then another person printed the blocks. So there were often 4 different people involved. But Hokusai, since he was sort of the designer of the image, he always gets the credit. And the other people are never mentioned. We don't, in some cases, even know what their names are. So it becomes a more complicated process, but this still uses the same relief sort of technique in wood blocks. There are other materials that have been used. Linoleum has been used. Linoleum put on top of wood blocks has been used to create this relief print. The kind of images that you may have made as children using potatoes, where you carved a potato and then you inked the image that you carved in the potato, that was probably a wood block or a relief type of technique also. So there are a few other materials, but it's primarily wood that's used. Then the second category of printmaking techniques is called intaglio, and there are several different ways of creating an intaglio plate. And the difference from relief is that the image that's going to be created, as Durr created this image here, is cut into a plate. They use copper plates. Copper, is a metal, but it's fairly soft. It's easy to cut. And they use a metal instrument to cut the image. And so the image, when it's inked, they wipe ink across the plate once again, and then they carefully wipe off the raised areas, leaving the ink in the depression areas. And so there's where the image is that's created. And this kind of technique is called engraving, when you use a metal stylus, when you use a metal instrument and you cut the image with that metal instrument. We call it engraving. And so here again, this is an image that was created by Dürer. I think I have a comparison. Let's see here. Yeah. Here is the engraved image over here. Here's the wood block. And you can see they can achieve very similar kinds of effects. You can actually get more detail using a engraved technique than you can a woodcut technique. And if you look at just the detail in the landscape and the various objects, you do have more detail in this work than you have over here in this particular work. So engraving is one of the techniques that was used in this intaglio category. It probably came from engraving metal armor, because as metal armor first developed in the Middle Ages, it was used as a defensive material. But towards the Middle Ages, and particularly in the Renaissance, when gunpowder was invented, metal armor would not stop a bullet. And so metal armor began to be a more decorative sort of item that men would wear at certain ceremonies. And then eventually it just became something that you decorated your house with, your castle with. And often when it became a more decorative item, they would engrave, floral patterns and different kinds of things onto the armor. And so some scholars believe that's where the idea came of making these kinds of prints, was from, first experimenting with armor. Then another kind of intaglio process, it still uses the basic idea that the image is cut into the metal plate, but it has a different way of cutting that image. And that is called an etching. And here you see the various processes that are gone through in creating an etching. They take a copper plate, they cover it with a waxy ground. That's what this word means. It's a protective layer that is placed on top of the metal plate. And then they take a metal stylus, metal like a pencil, and they draw in the wax and they create the image. And they make sure that wherever the image is going to be printed, that they cut that wax back to the metal plate, but they never cut the plate. They just cut the wax away. Then, after the image is placed on this, they put it in an acid bath, and the acid bites or etches that metal plate. So wherever the wax has been cut away, the acid can get to the metal, and it slowly eats it away. And you can vary the depth, and therefore how dark the lines are going to be that are created by what's called stopping out. Maybe, let's say this line right here. The artist would decide that's as deep as he wants the line to be, because he knows exactly how dark he wants that line to be. So he would pull this plate out of the acid. He would refill this whole area with some more of that ground, and then he'd put it back in. And this area is protected. It's not going to be eaten by acid anymore, but these areas aren't, so they're going to be eaten some more, and they're going to get deeper and deeper. And so that's how they can create variation in the plate. They use a variety of acids. If you're interested, I know they use hydrochloric acid, and there's some other kinds of acids that they use. They have to have ventilation, and so we have a big vent behind the printmaking area here because the acids produce fumes in the process of printing, and they have to vent the fumes out of the building. Here's what the lines look, the difference in the lines. At the top is what an etched line will look like, and down below is what an engraved line or a cut line will look like. An etched line is more irregular because even though you've got the wax, it tends to seep under the edges slightly. So it's not as clean a line as a engraved line is. And so again, it allows for slightly different kinds of effects. It allows for more expressionistic effects. In an engraving, you really have that hard sense of line, everything being described by a very precise line. And here you can sort of get these irregular areas of shadows in the works. Rembrandt's probably the best known of the artists to create etchings. He's one of the experts, one of the first experts that began to work with it. And here you're seeing one of his engraved plates, and this is called the fourth state of this plate because that means that he used this plate 4 times and printed it 4 times, but each time he varied it. He changed it somehow. And you can see all these sort of irregular, dark, really velvety, dark areas over here to the sides. That is just easier to create using an etching sort of technique than using all the precise lines. And I brought in just Dürer's effect, to show you the difference. One way that these darker areas is created in engraving, we've already talked about. We talked about hatching and cross-hatching and how, if you put enough lines together, it begins to give that effect of darkness. And so it's still line that's creating these areas here, and it just creates a different kind of effect than when you have these irregular sorts of areas that create the shadows in this particular work. Then sort of a secondary technique associated with engraving is what is called aqua tint. And it uses the same basic ideas of etching. You use that ground, that waxy resin, but instead of applying it uniformly across the whole surface, you use it in a powdered or sort of a pellet kind of form. And you apply it in certain areas and you leave gaps in other areas. And then the plate is heated slightly so that these little pellets melt together in places and they adhere to the surface. They won't come off the surface. Then it's put into the acid bath. And again, wherever the plate isn't covered by one of these pellets, it's eaten by the acid. And where it is covered, it isn't eaten. And aqua tint was developed probably in the 18th century. One of the first artists to use it was Francisco Goya in the late 18th century. And what it does, it provides an easier way of creating middle values. These grade sort of areas that you see up here in the background were created by aqua tint. And actually, if you look really closely at this, you can see that that grade area is sort of made up of little rounded sort of areas, little bumps. It almost looks like there's little bumps or texture here in the surface. Well, that's those little pellets that have been fused together to create these areas. And so usually aqua tint is combined with etching. The darker areas here and the forms here of the animals and birds and the figure, that was all etched using that traditional technique. And then he went back and put the aqua tint on the areas that are gray to create that effect. Then another technique is called lithography, or it's actually, the technique is called planography, but the typical kind of print that's made in this technique is a lithograph, and so often the technique is called lithography. And what happens in this is, and the best kind of lithographs that are made on stones. This was developed in the 19th century, the beginning of the 19th century, by a man in Bavaria who ran a chemical business. And he wanted a more efficient way of printing labels for his chemicals. And so he came up with this technique, and then artists began to experiment with it and liked, kind of effects they could create. And so the usual kind of material that's used for the stone or where the image is placed is Bavarian limestone. And Bavarian limestone is the only kind of limestone that is high enough quality to use. We've had graduate students experiment with Kansas limestone and Oklahoma limestone. It just doesn't work as well as Bavarian limestone. So, usually young students that are just learning this technique are given aluminum plates, and they work with aluminum plates. But then when they get big enough, they begin to use these stones, and the stones are very expensive and are sort of, the Bavarian limestone is disappearing, and so they're becoming even more expensive. So you take a stone, instead of cutting it in any way, you use a litho crayon. Remember, crayons have a lot of wax in them, and litho crayons particularly do. And so you have, really, it's just a carbon mixed with wax, and you draw on the surface. And so you can see the image better from the very beginning than you can engraving or etching or the woodcut sort of technique, and so you can better verify if this is exactly what you want the image to look like. So they draw in this waxy litho crayon on the surface, or they can use a liquid kind of crayon. It's called tush, and you can sort of paint it on, and then once that is placed, they put it into an acid bath very briefly to etch the surfaces that aren't covered by this image. And then they ink the top. And another thing they do is they also dip this into water so that the water will prevent the ink from being absorbed very easily by the stone here. And so the ink stays on the waxy image that's been created and not in these areas, of untouched stone or stone that has no image on it. And then this is run through a press and printed. And then once they've printed as many copies as they want, they can grind down the surface and remove that image so they can reuse the same stone again. And eventually, by grinding it down many times, they get the stone so small that it cracks when it's put through the presses, because the presses really press the paper down onto these plates or stones. And so eventually it gets too thin and it'll crack, and so they have to quit using it. So here's an image that was created using this new process, this lithography process. And this French artist named Honoré Daumier is really the first artist that really experiments with this to see what he can do with this litho technique. It's a quicker technique, because you can see the image immediately. You really know if you're getting, the kind of effect that you want to get in the work. It's almost like drawing. You're just drawing on a surface. There's not a lot of preparation, not a lot of steps after, the image is created. And so Honoré Daumier created a lot of images like this. He often created images for the newspapers and got into trouble for them. He was a socialist in France at about mid-century, and he often criticized the government. He often criticized lawyers and all members of society, and he criticized the king one too many times, and so he ended up in jail for 6 months because of it. Here he's just making a humorous image. He's not really trying to criticize anybody. After he got thrown into jail, he became a little more reluctant to create, political kinds of images. And so he began to just create this sort of humorous images. And so you see this man, gingerly lowering himself into a bathtub. And you may be thinking, well, why is he wearing a shirt? Because they often bathed in clothing in those days. You weren't supposed to be nude, and often they invited friends to come and visit them while they were bathing. And so he looks like he has his nightshirt on, and he's getting ready to take a bath, and he's lowering himself into the bathtub. Or it may be his shirt, because he does have his boots here, so it may be that he's just taken off his pants and he's just getting into the bathtub here. So, Daumier realized that you could really get spontaneous sorts of effects because of how directly you could draw on these stones. Another artist that worked with lithography was Toulouse-Lautrec. He used it for posters as well as just print images. This is one of his posters that he created. And he really experimented with how you could create different kind of textures and get different kind of expressive effects. And so sometimes he would take the litho crayon and just sort of dab at the surface, as you can see here in the background, to try and create a texture here in the background. So he really experimented a great deal. He also worked with color lithography. And the same thing happens in color lithography that happens in woodblock prints. You have to use registration. Every color has to have a separate stone created for it. So one stone for this poster had only this image here that was printed in red. Another stone had the yellowed areas. Another stone was defined by the black lines but was left white. You know, every color had to have a separate stone, and then so they had to register them to make sure that they overlapped. Toulouse-Lautrec really redefined posters. Before his time, posters had lots of words. You know, you had to stop and just read. And what Toulouse-Lautrec figured out was, you know, most people see posters as they're walking along the street. And they're not going to stop and read, you know, something that has 500 words on it. So you've got to make the image very direct. It's mostly got to be a visual image. You can't have too many words on it. And so in this particular instance with Jane Avril, he knew that everyone in Paris at that time knew that she was a famous dancer. And they also knew where she danced. She always danced at the Moulin Rouge. That was the only place she danced. She was famous for dancing the can-can. And so he decided, you know, I really don't have to put much else on there, but just to show a picture of her. And actually, she had red hair, but there was another singer and dancer at the time that did too. A lot of people would have just recognized her by the reddish hair that he gave her without even putting the words. But he must have decided, well, I don't want her confused with this other singer. So he put her name up there, showed her in the typical sort of pose of a can-can dancer, and left it at that. You know, he knew they'd know, well, she's back in town, she's dancing the Moulin Rouge, because it was the only place. So he really believed that posters had to be primarily visual. You had to have visual images that told the story and gave the information, not words. You know, people wouldn't pay attention to the words. And so you see it here. Jane Avril may have had to leave Paris for a while because she might have been arrested. I learned this from studying 18th and 19th century art. I hadn't realized it before. Can-can dancers didn't wear underpants. So, you know, when they kicked their legs up, the guys got quite a view. And so the government outlawed it. And if you were caught dancing the can-can, they could throw you into jail for a while, or they could fine you a lot. And so it may have been that she had to get out of town for a while, since she was so famous for dancing the can-can. Then finally, the final printmaking technique is called serography, but you probably know it better as silk screening, or screen processing is another way that it's explained. And it is a technique that developed in the 20th century. Again, it developed for commercial use primarily, and then artists began to experiment with it. The advantage of silk screening is that the image is upright. You know, all of these other images are reversed when they are printed. And while that doesn't affect things a great deal, sometimes it does affect slightly the way the image looks. And maybe it isn't the way the artist quite wants it when he suddenly sees it reversed. So in silk screening, you see it the way it's going to be printed. Exactly. It's upright. It's exactly the same way. And you see it from the beginning. And what happens in silk screening, you know, it's just like the way T-shirts are printed. A stencil is placed on a screen. The ink is spread over that screen using a squeegee or a rubber blade of some sort, and it's pressed through the screen. And the stencil, depending on whether it's solid, you're going to get a color, and the stencil is going to come out white. Or if they apply something to cover up all the screen except for where the image is going to be, then the image prints onto the surface. And so this was a technique that began to be used, and Andy Warhol is really the one that made it a legitimate sort of process for artists to use. He began to use screen printing in the 1960s. This is a famous one that he created of Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe died of an overdose of barbiturates and alcohol when she was only 36 years old, I believe. And right after her death, he produced this image of her as sort of an homage to her. And so he produced, one side in color, the other side, smeared as, maybe as if he's saying, her life has been rubbed out, has been ended. It's also been suggested that he was trying to show how the printing process can distort a person's image. With celebrities, it's so much what their image is. It's how they look. It's how they're presented to the public. And care is not always taken, with some people who print their images, and so sometimes they come out very poor quality. He really was interested in why people are famous and how that affects them and how that affects other people. And so he did a lot of images of famous people at the time. And from in the beginning to experiment with silk screening, a photographic silk screening developed. And Robert Rauschenberg used that technique as well as just regular silk screening to create images in the 60s also. Of political figures, he was often making comments about political events. Here you see Kennedy, JFK, in a typical kind of pose. He's really the first president that used television for press conferences. And because he was relatively handsome, he was very charming personality, and so he could really project himself on TV to the American public, and so this is sort of a typical image. And then Rauschenberg has combined it, with other images, such as this image of an astronaut. This, which some people say looks like a mushroom cloud, like, related to a nuclear bomb, this skeletal kind of image that you see over here, as if he's making some comments, about the arms race that we were in the middle of. And this is right after the big event that occurred with the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we thought for a while we were going to get blown up by nuclear bombs from Russia. And so he composed this using a combination of photographic sorts of techniques, silk screening techniques. There's also a technique where you can actually remove an image from a printed matter, such as a newspaper or magazine, and transfer it to an image. And that's where this image of JFK came from. So those are the four basic processes of printmaking. Okay, I'll let you go. I'm sorry.